Recording in progress.
All right, give me a second here. Sorry.
No worries.
Okay.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. Before we dive into today's agenda, we'd like to orient you to a couple of our Zoom protocols. Today's meeting will be supported using the closed captioning feature in Zoom. To access the closed captioning feature, please locate the live transcript button at the bottom of your participant panel and then click Show Subtitle. This will allow you to view closed captions in English throughout the entire presentation. If you would prefer to not have the closed captions at the bottom of your screen, simply do not click the Show Subtitle option. At any point during today's meeting, you can re-click the button and it will turn off that feature. I'll now turn things over to our interpreters to describe how you can listen to this meeting in English, Spanish, and Mandarin.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this meeting. My name is Giovanna Wormsbecker, and I'll be your Spanish interpreter. In order to provide language access, this meeting will have simultaneous bidirectional interpretation from English to Spanish and Mandarin. Please note that the translation globe will not appear until after I've read through all language instructions. Therefore, we're asking that everyone joining us for this event, please select your preferred language to facilitate hearing presenters and participants clearly, and to prevent technical glitches or interference occurring between the three language channels when one is not selected. If you're on a laptop, please locate the icon shaped like a globe at the bottom of your screen, click on language interpretation, and then select English. If you're not on an iPad or a phone or a similar device, then locate the three-dot menu on the right corner of your screen, click on language interpretation, and then select English. When you speak, please do so at a moderate pace because the interpreter is going to be simultaneously interpreting everything you say. Buenos días a todos y bienvenidos a esta reunión. Mi nombre es Giovanna Wormsbecker, seré una de sus intérpretes en español. Esta reunión contará con interpretación simultánea bidireccional en inglés y en español y mandarín. El globo de traducción no va a aparecer hasta que yo haya leído todas las instrucciones en inglés y en español y también se leerán en mandarín. Por lo tanto, les pedimos a todos los presentes que seleccionen su idioma preferido para facilitar escuchar a los presentadores y a los participantes con claridad, evitando que se produzcan fallas técnicas o interferencias entre los canales lingüísticos cuando uno no ha sido seleccionado. Si está usando una computadora, verá un icono en la parte inferior de la pantalla a la derecha en forma de globo que dice Interpretación. Haga clic ahí y seleccione Español. Si está utilizando un iPad o teléfono, localice el menú de 3 puntos que aparece arriba a la derecha, haga clic en Interpretación de idiomas y se elija Español. Cuando sea su turno de hablar, por favor recuerde hablar con voz fuerte y clara y a un paso moderado, ya que el intérprete estará interpretando simultáneamente al otro idioma. Now I will turn things over to our Mandarin interpreter. Thank you.
大家早上好，欢迎参加本次会议。我的名字是 Sarah， 我和亚楠是今天的普通话翻译。为了提供语言服务，本次会议将提供从英语翻译为西班牙语和普通话的双向同声传译。请注意，在我们读完英文、西班牙文和中文说明之后，翻译频道的地球图案才会出现。为了避免未选择语言频道而导致技术性故障或干扰，我们要求参加本次活动的每个人，请从3种语言中选择您想听的语言，以便清楚地听到发言者和与会者的声音。如果您使用的是笔记本电脑，请在屏幕底部找到一个地球形状的图标后，点击语言翻译，然后选择英语或普通话 Mandarin。如果您使用的是 iPad 或手机或类似设备，请找屏幕右上角的3点，点击语言翻译，然后选择英语或普通话 Mandarin。当您发言时，请放慢速度，让口译员能够同步翻译您所说的所有内容。谢谢。Now I will turn it over to Karen. Thank you.
Actually, does anybody have any questions about interpretation? Hearing none, I will now enable interpretation and live transcript. Please make sure to select your appropriate language.
Great. I think with that, Janelle, can I turn things over to you to sort of set the stage today for us?
Sure. Well, welcome back, everyone. I feel like we're at the midway point, but really getting into the ability to hopefully make some real strides today in terms of how we start to see the ideas that you've all been sharing over the last several months coming together in the form of recommendations, coming together in the form of information, and some frameworks that will then be used as we take the next steps with the cost model. So thank you once again for making time for today's work group meeting and for adding one more Zoom to your week. I hope this is nearing the end of Zoom land for you. Just as a reminder, and David just put this in the chat, as with our prior meetings, what we're going to do is we're having 2 opportunities for public comment. The first will be in the chat feature, which will open up after we go through our overview, and then it will be followed by a open session where it's both chat and verbal comments. And so one thing that I just wanted to say up front in this meeting is we did provide materials in advance, and I hope everyone's had a chance to review that. Those have been posted at the projects or the work group's website, as well as shared by email with individual work group members. And just a reminder to work group members, I think what we found very helpful was to see that people were reviewing the materials. A few people offered comments, so I would just remind folks that this is a public body. So those comments that you shared, if we could make sure that we restate them here today for the public, and in the future, just remember, part of our process is to have things available to the public as we go through this process. So bringing your comments to this space so that we get the benefit of people hearing it, but also then contributing through their comments as we're working through our work. So what we have planned for you today is we are going to start with, as we have with every meeting, a recap of where we are. I think each time we get deeper and with more to share. And so this includes the draft report and where that is and wanting to get your comments. We'll then move from there. We've invited Peter Mangione, who is part of the WestEd team and a real expert in child outcomes, child learning, and he will be coming and sharing with us about some of the research of looking at how do we start to talk about child outcomes? What are the things that the research indicates, and how might we use that as we talk about what we're looking for in a rate structure and a model. And then from there, we're going to revisit some of the materials and information that our partners at P5 shared at the last meeting regarding New Mexico and DC and what they have used to formulate their base rate. We've organized that information in a way that we hope we can walk you through and get very engaged around how would we start to define the base rate in the California context. And the reason we want to do this today is because it'll allow us to then, at our meeting next week, have P5 come back and then take what we're doing today and start to really work through how to build the cost model. And I'll put real emphasis here on both words, cost model. So this is not cost decision, but in order to put together a cost model, we need to start to get to some of the features or the ways that we want to see this being organized so the models can be created, models being ways to look at something before you decide something, and then we can go back and iterate. So that's what we're here to do today. I think like the saying goes, when you're having a great time, time flies. So let's hope that this 3 hours goes fast for you. We do have a break incorporated along the way. Karen and I will do our best to keep pace with all of you as we move through the morning with you. So before I begin, any comments or anything I've said that people want to pause on or make sure we do in the course of our time together today? Okay, hearing none, seeing no hands raised. I'm going to go back to sharing the slides that we have for today. And just a reminder, these have been posted at the Workgroup website as well as they were sent out to workgroup members via email. So just here's, you've seen over the last few meetings, the framework that has captured vision as well as decisions by this group or guidance by this group in the areas that are to be addressed through this work group. And so this is, let's call it same information, just different colors and shape as a means to start to put this together in a visual. And you saw this in the draft report also being used as a means to start to say, how are we making the connections in the information that we're talking about as we work towards this vision of a single reimbursement rate structure. This is the broad charge for this work with regard to what the Joint Labor Management Committee is charged with, for which our work as a work group is informative to. We have talked over the last several months about several key principles, so equity, quality, child outcomes, workforce well-being, and accessibility. You can see in the where that leads is to some really key ways that we see that manifesting in what we want from a structure, and then very concretely what that could look like with regard to recommendations. And again, this is some of these we certainly have time that we will be taking in this meeting as well as future meetings talking further about, but I think this is where under recommendation number 1, single reimbursement rate structure, establish a base. Today's conversation is focused on what that involves, what it looks like, getting to further detail. The last meeting that we were at, you can look at recommendation number 2, where we had pending decisions about target universalism. Some look at, we've talked about equity and quality, and today we'll include a bit more as we talk about child outcomes. So these pending decisions, discussions are things that, we may have introduced to some degree that we're continuing to work through. And then, number 3 is a systems recommendations of factors that we've said. These are really important conditions if we're going to be successful in the rate structure, including the sustainability of the funding, taking a phased-in approach, but also I think we've heard loud and clear for the work group, not taking this as something that is taking too long. So getting it so that we can manage and see results, being able to maximize other funds, really pulling together the concepts of equity, quality, child outcomes, and workforce well-being. So we've spent some time making sure that we're talking about how child outcomes is related to how we support our workforce. We will be having a bit more details and conversation, but recognition, and Kim has made comments in the past about this, of the alignment with tribal programs, and then called out specifically in the statute is alignment with Head Start and related programs. So a number of things that we have also surfaced in our conversations, which is under number 4, that we have put here as things that will go beyond this work group's time of focus on these immediate recommendations, but a number of things that we know will need to come and be very related to support and make any recommendations operational and meaningful. So this is nothing really new here, but just a new representation of this as a means to show the bigger picture and the connections that come as we're moving through this work, and seeing where you have made some clear decisions, where we have open discussions, and where we're heading in terms of finalizing there. So I'm going to actually hold on getting your comments to this because this isn't new information, and hold till we go into how it may appear and be used in the report. So, I'm going to start sharing here the draft report and that was sent out to everyone. And there were 2 pieces to this. So there was the draft report, and then we shared in a separate document the call outs of things that were then the considerations that we hope to work through with you, both in today's meeting, but also in the upcoming, probably the next upcoming few meetings. So I just want to, say as a caveat, it's, when you put things down electronically, they look like they're more done than they are. So if we had the ability, this would have all been written in pencil. And so I'm basically wanting you to remember, we're handing you the pencils right now to both like scribble on the sidebar and also maybe erase a few things as we move through this. So, and that's really the comments that we need from you. And as we take your comments in, both through your feedback on the outline, as well as the items that we have on today's agenda, we'll keep working on this draft. And so as we move into subsequent meetings, you'll start to see more things either fleshed out or changes made based on your feedback. So this draft is focused on how do we capture your ideas within the context of what's required from the legislation and the statutory focus that we are working towards. So, and with the strong caveat that there are many areas that require further discussion and decisions. Today is certainly part of our process, and we have a few more meetings, but it's a work in progress. So this is our attempt to start to give you something that you can see the initial understandings of our discussions appearing in the recommendations. What we'd like to turn you to is just, I'll give you a quick run through of this. And what we'd like to focus on is what you see in the recommendation section, and are there key areas missing? Are there things that you want to make sure that we are addressing or adding? So let me just give a quick review here. We're envisioning an executive summary to make this accessible and more shareable. We've talked extensively about the vision graphic as a means to help situate the report. There's the context in the introduction, which is the what and why of this effort, including a bit of the background and the history that accompanies this work. So you'll recall back in March, we had started with what's the foundation, what's Blue Ribbon, what's the past work group, what's master plan, et cetera. Those are all things we would imagine appearing in brief in the introduction. The next section is outlined as the vision, workgroup vision and guiding principles. So these are things that are in the visual, being able to explain and put the narrative behind those ideas. So certainly as we're talking through today, should there be new ideas or ways that this needs to be edited, we will take that into account. But these are directly related to what you see in the vision document. So the section I want to, spend a bit of our time today just getting your feedback is on this rate and quality work group recommendation. So this is the main body of the report. And so this takes us to the recommendations organized around the areas that you see in the vision document. And so it's a single rate reimbursement structure and elements that are part of that recommendation. The next area is establishing a base rate or base funding, and the elements, again, specifically related to that, many of which we will be talking through today. And then we have as a third section is making continuous evaluation of the model, and then a number of related recommendations that include both systems, and that's where we capture the sustainable funding, phased-in approach, and then equity, and being able to have a reference to equity, some definitions for what that might appear in this work, and and many of the things that we heard from you in reaction and response to the presentation by Carlise. We also here have a section on quality, which is both child outcomes and workforce well-being. And you can see a number of things that we have talked about, but also many things that we will continue to talk about this meeting and the next meeting as to what specifically should be called out in those sections. And then more details both for child outcomes, workforce well-being, and we will talk more in a moment with Peter's presentation about child outcomes. And then we have a place here to put more details around accessibility. So this gets to the way that people interact with the opportunities related to what was recognized in the rate structure, as well as making sure that this system is addressing, operationalizing the equity principles that we've seen for not only providers, but families and children. And then finally, the section on alignment, which we have some details there for. And then the last pieces here are, we are charged with doing some assessments. So there's things that we have already surfaced around some of the concerns with existing structures and models. This has been well documented, and we'll put together some summary of those pieces into that section. And then some closing sections on developing alternative methodology, which P5 has talked to us extensively and will help contribute some information as we put that together. And then in our next meeting, we'll be hearing from the Advancement Project to talk about parent voices in this. And so we'll be able to incorporate more information into some additional background. So, and then there's a number of things that have come up that we thought were very helpful in terms of definitions, relevant research, more on competencies, target universalism, other fiscal strategies that P5 has elevated that we thought may have a place in the appendix for people to reference. So that is the very quick tour of what's in the outline. And what I'd like to open this up for are for you to give us some reaction response. Let me also say we are welcoming of anything you want to mark up in the document, you want to send over, because what we'll then do is consolidate your comments to come up with the next iteration of this document, so that you can see how this is, your feedback is evolving into the report itself. So, so I'll just open it up and let's hear from you, particularly as you review the recommendation sections. Were there things, anything that jumped out at you as needing to be addressed, or any of the questions or issues that we posed as being open and needing to address that you'd like to, double click on, or, tell us we need to add some attention to as we move through our upcoming meetings?
Is it time for the work group to respond?
Yes, please. I'm sorry, Eric. Thank you for clarifying. So work group members, please feel free to open up the conversation here and share with us your observations or any particular points of feedback.
First of all, excellent job. This is great. Very helpful and clear. The one thing I kind of noticed was under workforce well-being in the vision graphic, and then later, I think in number 4, we have recruitment and retention together. I think those are two very different things that need to be broken out. So I would like to see some more emphasis put on retention. I know, like, really early on in Prop 10/First 5 in Alameda County, we spent a lot of time and money giving providers stipends for staying in the field. And that was tremendously helpful for those providers. And it had a meaningful impact on their businesses and income. And then we moved away from that and went more into the quality stuff. So I just think we need to just tease that retention part out a little bit, and B, I don't know if P5 is doing any kind of work. I don't know if there's any other retention models out there in other states. So I'd just like to know if there's anything out there on that. That's it. But overall, excellent work. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And Eric Sonnenfeld, we see your hand. Please go ahead.
It's the dynamic duo. Happy Friday, everyone. Excellent job on the report. 2 things that I noticed through reading on page 3 specifically, on item, I believe it's I, under the, let me get there, established base funding. There's a reference to Title 22 standards, home-based programs, Title 5 standards, center-based programs meeting Title 22 standards. I'm assuming that's trying to say Title 22 centers meeting Title 5 standards. Because if you're a center that doesn't meet Title 22, you're in trouble already. So I think that's just a thing there. And then J, on the next one, there's a bunch of bullet points that talk about age of the child and that sort of thing. Want to make sure when this comes to implementation, whatever age group buckets we decide, they align with either community care licensing's definition of age groups, or we change those so they actually align with whatever rate structure we create. Because currently there's a disconnect, which causes some barriers in the system for families to move through nicely because of the current rate structure. So we have to align those. Otherwise, providers may get confused and it may create a detriment to certain options for service. And then lastly, on the provider well-being section, just a general comment. I think there's something missing here to support the workforce. Is rates are important, quality supports are important, but I believe we also need to support them as independent business owners. So there's a lot of compliance issues that we never talk about in these rate groups, that you may be making great money. However, if you get in trouble with the Internal Revenue Service, all your good work goes down the drain. So we want to make sure that those independent business people are supported appropriately so they do not get into that kind of compliance trouble, so they can actually concentrate on the actual day-to-day work of supporting children and families. But all in all, great job, everyone.
Thank you, Eric. Leah, good morning. I see your hand.
Hi, good morning. Just echoing the comments on, really good work getting to this point. I know it's been a lot, so this is really looking good, and it's great to see so many of the comments along the way are really being reflected and incorporated here. A couple of specific things. Eric Peterson, I want to just echo and put a check mark next to his comment about stipend programs as a retention strategy. Of course, better compensation overall, but definitely thinking about immediate recruitment and retention, separating those is I think really important. Under child outcomes, there's reference to the targeted universalism strategy. I would like to suggest and offer that somehow be used to frame the full approach under the recommendations. I think we need to be saying that for the workforce as well, especially I think because what we know currently is that depending on where people are working and with which children and parts of the state, we can have something that may seem to be working for children and families really well in one aspect, but not necessarily for the workforce. So applying that language to the workforce as we think about strategies to support their well-being, I think would be really important here. And on continuous evaluation, I would really like us to have something specifically about data collection, which can be different than people think about evaluation and looking at program outcomes, being very clear about needing a data system that's collecting data about the workforce as well as program and child outcomes in order to be able to assess how change is impacting the workforce as well as children and families, and looking at issues of equity on an ongoing basis.
Thank you, Leah. Stephen, looks like you're next.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. So want to echo what I heard about the workforce, and then absolutely agree with Leah's comments about the data system and being able to collect it. And so something along those same lines, thinking about some of those important concepts that we've heard in previous work group sessions, a concept such as love and compassion and connection that comes in settings, feeling the need to define that, and then how do we design a structure for this around reimbursement rates, et cetera? How is it measured, or things like the class assessment, are those kind of things that we should be considering, which class measures effectiveness of child outcomes of an adult-child interactions, and we know how important those relationships between children and adults are. In looking at child outcomes, so the experience of the child and needs of the whole child and whole family, we think that we need to put somewhere what the needs of the whole child and whole family are. So, for example, whole child, whole family might be like opportunities for the family to provide feedback and engage in conversations about the child's strengths, nutrition during the day, supporting transitions to kindergarten, valuing and uplifting family culture and language through bilingual programs and bilingual educators, family involvement in the IEP process when applicable, no suspensions or expulsions, and connecting families to libraries and other community resources and events. And I think maybe the final thing I'll say is just we want to, when we think about like the workforce well-being, we can't forget about how important coaching is. Studies have shown that investments in coaching in the environment that providers work in has many positive outcomes for providers that one-time professional development or offsite trainings tend to lack.
Thank you, Stephen. Deborah, I see your hand. I'm eager to hear from your perspective, family child care.
Yes, good morning, everyone. So I hope I'm on this correctly. We're going to review this or give our opinion. So here goes. So first I want to say under the workforce well-being, I look at the word recruitment. When I look at the word recruitment, I think, nope, not me. Because I can't recruit anyone to do this because healthcare and retirement is so important. Without it, and you get sick, it's just not worth it. So I find it interesting for family daycare providers to recruit people to this field. It's going to be difficult because of what's going on. The second thing I want to say is under the established base funding. It says the base should acknowledge experience in the field, the provider's skills development over many years, which is true. Thank you for that. And early measured and educational attainment in the ECE field. What about other degrees? I have a business degree. When I went into this field, I didn't know I was going to be doing this. So I have a business degree. Does that mean my degree is any lesser? So we have to make sure that we're not just measuring those degrees as in early education and child development, but we have to also consider those who have degrees, period, masters, et cetera. We actually have those for some who may not know that are home-based providers in the early education educators that have masters and that have PhDs. So we have to remember those people who also have degrees. Secondly, I want to say something. It mentions under the base rate variables, under recommendations that nutritious meals and snacks are included in the base rate. So how do we measure that? Do we measure it because if someone may be a home-based provider may be on the food program? Everyone's not on the food program. So how do you actually measure that? Are you saying that everyone would have to join or be a part of the food program? So that would be difficult. And everyone doesn't want to do the food program. So our hope and our thought, and perhaps in training, making sure our providers, have educational information on nutrition. But wait, that is also included in the 16 hours or 17 hours they changed it, nutrition before they become receive their license. So that's already there. So that's what I just found interesting. How do you measure that? The other thing was, I'm sorry, it wasn't so much, but it was great. Again, develop policies. Yeah, this was interesting for me. Develop policies to hire and retain educators and administrators who look like the children and families they are serving. It's okay to look different. It's important to look different because what that does, that also gives everyone a feeling of, it teaches kids how to include everyone. Doesn't matter the race or the color. So that's like saying that when many years ago, when a young lady who was Japanese, when she knocked on my door, she and her baby Michelle came to my home. Because I didn't look like her, she shouldn't have come here. She came here and she enjoyed it. When my neighbor, who's Cambodian, knocked on my door, do you have space for childcare? Yes, bring Jacob in. You know what I'm saying? So, because I don't look like them, does that mean they're not welcome? They're welcome. Everyone's welcome. But when I read that, it just says to me, you know, hey, don't hire people, Deborah, who don't look like you or the kids you serve. And even in the state preschools and all, we can't encourage that because you're excluding people. If I'm in a community where more people speak are Hispanic, does that mean when I knock on the door for a job that they shouldn't hire me because I don't look like the kids? No, include everyone, teach everyone. That is your opportunity at the most valuable moment for a child to include them. So truly, when I read that, you see my passion, because I was like, then who would I have? Who would I have? Who would I have?
Thanks, Deborah.
So thank you very much for that. But other than that, it looks great to me, but just little things.
Thank you. Donna, I see your hand.
I just want to, say thank you for all the work that went into this. It clearly has taken into account a lot of what we have said. The two things I wanted to flag, one, I'm a little concerned with the idea of stipends in general, and I saw that Eric Sonnenfeld put something in the chat. You know, we've done a lot of giving short-term bursts of money to people, but that's not a sustainable career. And I think when we think about retention and recruitment of our workforce, it's about an ongoing salary. It's not about a stipend. And I think we've got to really reframe our thinking. You know, people don't go into careers and industries because they're going to get a one-time stipend if they do something. They go into it because there's an ongoing sustainable career path. And I think that we've got to be really cognizant of that. The other thing, I'm a little skeptical. I will be honest, I've had these conversations for a really long time. I'm a little worried about complexity and the fact that we're going to create a system that will not be understandable to people. We have been criticized for years that our system is too complicated. And I think we've got to really boil things down to base fundamental core components that are easily described and easily measured and easily explained, because otherwise we're going to spend another 15, 20 years trying to explain to people that it's really not that complicated. But you know, I look at all these different components and I can hear what I've heard for years and years and years, which is this is too complicated, nobody understands it. So I really caution against adding too many components and having too many details like because I think it's going to come back and haunt us. And that's just from experience. But thank you for everything that went into this. I think we're on the right track.
Thank you, Donna. Madi, I see your hand.
Good morning. I just wanted to make sure to bring the comments that I had shared via email to the public forum. So I did share that I like the new graphic. I wasn't sure how you would accomplish the goal of getting everything clearly in one place, but you did, and I think it looks great. I had made a comment about workforce well-being, and I wasn't sure if that we really meant workforce stability or something around a robust workforce that's sustainable. So I just wanted to see if we can revisit what that might be changed to. I wanted to see a little bit more focus on recruitment and retention. I had shared previously about the costs and barriers and challenges to actually entering the workforce and being deemed qualified within our other state systems, such as having a child development permit, having a minimum number of units. We are losing a lot of our career early childhood professionals to other industries because they're getting paid more without having to demonstrate units, training, experience, and ongoing professional development. So I had highlighted a few of those costs, stating that it costs hundreds of dollars to become eligible to work, including those 6 to 12 college units. providing transcripts, providing local multiple live scans for Department of Justice, for community care licensing, again, the child development permit and the timing that it takes, immunizations. Again, sometimes the employer pays for these, but not all the time. And probably not most of the time. And we have other complicated systems, to echo Donna's remarks about, child development training consortium and things like that. But those are additional barriers that you have to actually have the money and then be reimbursed. So I wanted to bring that forward. Again, as a system, we need to address the recruitment part. I also hope that we can be a platform for advocating for more access to education, because right now there are barriers to moving beyond an associate's degree to a bachelor's degree, which I've mentioned before. We don't have enough programs at the public university offered in a variety of modalities that meet the needs of our current workforce. I also raised the possibility of changing dual language to multilingual to account for families that actually are learning various different languages. One example would be our Native American Indigenous population who are actually trilingual. So that's kind of the direction that we've been moving with super diversity and across the nation. So I wanted to bring that up. And then just as far as the report goes, rule of thumb is usually to keep it at a 6th grade level. I saw the word betress. I personally have never used that word, never heard it before. And so I just want to make sure that anyone can pick up this report and understand it. So thank you.
Thank you, Madi, for all those great points. Any other feedback, for example, that was emailed and you haven't yet expressed them verbally here? Deborah.
I'm sorry, thank you. I'm looking under continuous evaluation of the model. Number C, once a single reimbursement for rate structure is finalized, there needs to be a transparency and information around how the final structure works. Great. How reimbursements are calculated and et cetera. So when I read that, I was also thinking the transparency of it. Home-based providers should and need to know how it's calculated exactly. That should be, as far as I'm concerned and feel as other providers, it should be on DSS website or somewhere to where a provider can go in, plug in their numbers, their information, and know that they're being properly and fairly reimbursed. To me, that's a part of the transparency. That is true, and that's really, really important for home-based providers, because so many times someone will call and say, this wasn't correct. So a part of that base rate, I need to make sure if I'm hitting all those dots on that base rate, that I'm being fairly reimbursed. And I need to know how to calculate that. And that's important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Madi, I see your hand again.
So sorry, there are a few statements about the stipends, and having been part of the CARES project for a long time, I know that having 1099s issued for a stipend is very difficult for providers. First of all, you get the stipend, but then you have to account for the tax later on in the year. And so that's difficult. And then when it's part of payroll, you're promised, let's say $1,000, but you don't get $1,000 because it's taxed. So I wanted to also echo that it should be something better. It should just be part of the system. It is a Band-Aid and it does raise issues for some providers. Thank you.
Thanks, Madi. And thank you all for your thoughtful read of the draft, your input thus far. It's all incredibly helpful and certainly very thoughtful input. I wonder, Janelle, if now, just given all we need to do, if I should talk about public comment and then we go from there?
Let me make one quick comment, Karen,
Yeah,
and then we
please.
should remind folks about the public comment. And that is, this is, you're providing exactly the right kind of feedback to us to help us continue making some progress with the report. What we plan to do at the next meeting is we'll continue to work on this, incorporating your feedback and thoughts. And so you'll start to see that form. What we will do, because I know this is getting to be a lengthy document, is we'll just have some summaries of what you can find and where you can find it so that you don't have to like read it again and go, what did they do last time? I think the other piece that we will have for you is a schedule of where you're going to get to see sections. So what we'll do is we'll start to break this into sections of much more depth to what's written, and then really encourage you to read everything, but particularly those things that you have deep interest in and your own personal expertise can help guide how it is formulated. So you'll be seeing much more coming. We'll start to parse it, and then start to do some highlights so that it's hopefully facilitates your navigation as you move through this content. So that will start with our next turn as we meet next week. Okay, so Karen, go ahead and remind us about public comment. And I know we're trying to get our presenter out of the waiting room. So we'll go, hopefully by the time we do that, we'll be able to get Peter to join us.
Great. Well, it's just a simple announcement, which is that we will now be opening up the chat feature to all members of the public who are attendees at this meeting so that you can provide written public comment for the public record now. And we'll keep that chat feature open for about 5 minutes. And then again, just as Janelle mentioned earlier in the meeting, we will also open up for public comment before we wrap up, and we'll be offering both the chat feature and then also an opportunity for verbal comment. So thank you, and we'll just continue to move on as the written chat comment comes in. So how are we doing with letting Peter in from the waiting room? Any status from those at WestEd? Do we have a sense of which door he's standing at right now?
Hey, Janelle, we are working on sending him a new link, so it's going to be a couple minutes.
Okay. Well, what I'll do is I'll slow roll us by resharing the slides and giving some context to what we have in the base rate, and I'll be Peter's warm-up act as we get him ready to join us. So this is really the bulk of our time together today is diving deeper into the single rate structure, so identifying the base rate components. What we will be doing with Peter's help is giving you a bit more information about child outcomes and provider outcomes. So I'm going to not share those slides for a second, because we thought it would be helpful to have Peter share that as we contemplate a number of key questions with regard to the base rate. And these are not, I think, new questions for us. There's ones that we introduced, some of which we introduced from the very start of this process, and really wanting to look at what do we mean by base rate? So we've had the opportunity to hear from P5 and the work that they've done in other states and how other models have emerged with alternative methodology. We've had some time to talk about what matters to each of you and your various perspectives as to what we need to recognize and acknowledge in the system. We've had some time to talk about, where things need to be the same and when things need to be different. And I think, Donna, the helpful reminder of we have to keep this simple, or where have we gone? So I think we'll, be really working on that is this part of the goal of this is to get more simple. So if, how, the identification of base rate being part of that. And then related to that is what are the complements? So we're not talking about everything funded, but you have elevated that you need to see something recognized as a core part of funding in this base rate. And so are there things that add to our complement base rates? So for instance, Deborah already raised nutrition funding and programs that we have. There's also, people have mentioned various programs on training or stipends, et cetera, that are available. So what then do we need to see or want to see or expect to see with regard to things that complement this rate, so that we can feel confident that as we've determined what the rate is, it really fits into a system of funding. And so I want to go through a few things before Peter joins us about how we'll do this from process standpoint. We have organized some, I'll call it areas for discussion and potential decisions for you, with key questions that we hope will explain potential options and guide us to narrowing those options and maybe even reaching some group consensus on a decision. So the process that we're going to use for the discussion as we go through base rate will be to review each of the areas, to talk through each of the options, allow for there to be clarifying questions, and then discussions that we hope will lead to narrowing to a few options, so that we're not thinking about 8 different ways, but maybe getting it down to 2 or 3. And then coming back after we've had the discussion to ask ourselves, can we revisit and decide? So can you live with some of these options? And if not, what needs to be different? So we'd ask you to raise both, if you can live with it, and if not, be clear about what would need to be different. How do we make it work? So we're really focused on the working group aspect of your title of the working. We need to work together to think about how it's going to work. So that's the process that we will be using as we proceed through these options and the discussion of the base rate today. And we're going to use as our starting point some of the frameworks that were introduced by P5, because it allows us to then compare and contrast to how we may be different and or see ourselves similar to what was done in New Mexico. Okay, so another state that has something in place. So we're still working on getting Peter on the webinar. We believe he has all of the links. My suspicion is this is where it's the probably something laptop related, and we'll hopefully he can reboot and join us. But before I proceed, any questions or requests about the discussion we'll have over the next probably hour and a half or so?
I see Carla's hand.
Very excited about having this conversation. So a little bit about the previous conversation on the report. Just want to give lots of gratitude to all the work group members. Those are all your ideas, and trying to summarize the best practices from the expertise that all of you hold. And also want to thank Nancy Stroll, that many of you have been working with as we look to capture work group conversations. So just want to express that gratitude. In regards to the base, a lot of you have expressed what Donna shared. We need a system that we can explain and is something that we can all understand and is very transparent. As Deborah was lifting up the idea of just having that public information will be really helpful. So as we talk about the base, it is those variables that we will be measuring in the cost model. And the hope is to get to X number of variables today, and we will unpack more later. I just wanted to share, there's 2 variables that we've heard really clearly. One is licensing or licensing equivalent. So we've talked about family, friend, and neighbors, family childcare homes, childcare centers, and that will be a variable that we'll unpack later, but we've heard that that is one that we really want to spend some time on. And the second one that also related to licensing is ratios, child age. So that's the type of discussion we're looking to have. And I see Peter joined, so we might be pinging back, but I just wanted to throw out those 2 variables that we've already heard from the work group.
Thank you, Carla.
Okay.
Yeah, Janelle, maybe I
say thanks, Carla. That's really good reminders, and some appreciate the recognitions of all those that have contributed to this. So I see that we're joined by Peter. So Peter, I've slow rolled us to given a bit of context about the base rate discussions. And so let me do a brief introduction of Peter Mangione, who I believe for this audience requires little in the way of introduction because he's a legend. And, I think I'm privileged to be among Peter's colleagues at WestEd. And Peter has just, I think, made such significant contributions to how we think about young children, particularly infants and toddlers, and their care needs. I think, we are in good hands with Peter in terms of understanding of both research, but also practice, and not just that which exists in California, but around the country and actually around the world. And so, Peter, we are so glad that you're here to join the work group today to share a little bit of your wisdom and helping us, giving us ways to think about child outcomes based on the research and how this group may be able to attend to that within the modeling of rates. So Peter, all yours. I have your slides, so I'm happy to share those whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you, Janelle. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's really an honor to be with you today. I think the work that your group is doing is so important. It's fundamentally important for our state and our field, and for all young children and families in California. I do want to check my volume. Is this working okay for everyone? Super, great. I also want to mention, and it's part of my background, yes, I've been focused on infants and toddlers, but I've also been very involved with preschool in California, providing leadership in the development of the preschool learning foundations and the preschool curriculum frameworks. I started out at WestEd doing the analysis of the longitudinal study of the family development, Syracuse University Family Development Research Program. So I am familiar with that body of longitudinal research that was done in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and even today there are follow-up studies occurring. And I've worked closely with data sets and colleagues on that type of question. That's my background, and I think we're finding ourselves at a point in our field where we've experienced a lot of disruption. It was a field that was not quite, it was a field that was always under-resourced, and the pandemic has created a much more serious issue for us. We have to build up the system, and I think this conversation is a very important part of building it up. Janelle, I am ready for the first slide. So I was asked to talk about child outcomes and provider outcomes. And as I've thought about this, there are four assumptions behind my thoughts about this. One is, and I've already started to suggest this, is that we need a statewide system with clearly defined, agreed upon outcomes. And to build that, it's going to require time. And we need to take the time to do that. The second assumption I'm making is that we want to focus on the well-being of children and their development. So we want to focus on what are the outcomes for the children right now in their experience, and how can we think about longer term outcomes for children. So it's both parts. Likewise for providers, they are our workforce. We know they are essential. They're very important, and we need to think about their well-being right now, and we need to think about how they can continue to develop to be effective in their work. So I would suggest, and my last assumption is that our first step is to engage all of you, leadership, interest groups, providers, and families to identify, define, and I would say pilot, try out, but try out on a pretty broad scale outcomes that as a community of an early childhood community in California, we say, these are our starting points. This is what we're going to start to focus on, and we're going to build from here. We can go to the next slide. So when I think about child outcomes in the broadest sense, I think about what they mean for the child, and you could extend that to the family. And if we think about that child's perspective, the well-being of the child, and we think that we need to start with short-term outcomes to get to the longer-term outcomes. What are those short-term outcomes that are important for every child? And from the child's perspective and the family's perspective is what the outcome is, what the child is experiencing in care. What is that child's experience in care? So we want to start there, and we want to use research as a guide in doing this. Research isn't going to tell us everything. We have a lot of practical experience, and we need to use everything we know from the care and early education, the early care and education that we're providing young children in our state. Research can inform us, and we certainly want to rely on it. And we want to look at some of those benefits. And we know if we focus on the well-being, that we can start to build a model that takes us to what those longer-term outcomes might be. But I don't think we want to skip that step of the short-term outcomes to get to the longer-term outcomes. Let me give you an example. We know that it's enormously beneficial for a young child to have an emotionally secure relationship in care. That has an immediate benefit for the child. We know that. We also know from longitudinal research that children who do have emotionally secure relationships early in life, during the early years, those children are more successful in school. They develop self-regulation, which helps them. So what we want to do is start with that. What is the child's experience, the well-being, and then we can start to look at how we connect it up in the longer term, taking that development perspective. So let's go to, and this is just a starting list. I think it's going to require discussion. I presented this list last week and there have been some minor changes, but I'm not suggesting this is the list we should use. But certainly, I believe there are some elements in this list that I would like to see as answers to the question, what do we want every child to experience in care or in our early childhood programs? I should say care, and I would include preschool as a starting point. And we can talk about what else might need to happen as we go and what we're building to, but let's start with this discussion and see if we can come in with an agreement around these short-term kinds of outcomes from the child's perspective. So last week I presented these ideas in a list, and Carla suggested to me we could use Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so I'm using a kind of a simple way of showing that. And when I think of that from that perspective, one of my first outcomes, very first, is over on the left side. Child consistently experiences attentive care in an emotionally and physically safe and healthy environment. That's what the child's experience is. Receiving attention, attentive care, and feeling emotionally and physically safe and healthy. That is in an environment where the child can feel that way and what the child is experiencing. Also, is really fundamental, that is really basic, the child experience is being respected for who they are and where they come from. That we just really focus on that kind of way of looking at the child. Over on the right side, active physical play. We know health is very important, and we know that our children need to move. And that's very important for their well-being now, but it's going to also have benefits longer term. We want to make sure that children feel validated, and this is part of for who they are, but we know in our state, with so many of our children in our early care and education programs, in coming to our programs with a different home language, we want to make sure that an outcome for the child is experiencing validation and support. That's part of that sense of who you are. Then going up, back on the left side, we want to make sure, and we have research which tells us this is an issue, but we also know from practice even more so that equitable treatment is fundamental. We also know that full inclusion of children and the steps being taken that every child is experiencing right now in care, equitable treatment, full inclusion, and every child is developing a sense of belonging. That's a really important outcome for that child and for the child's family. We want to make sure that everything the child is bringing to care, I'm up on the fourth, if you're counting up, there we go, with the pointer, that the child, that we know that every experience the child has with, and we know how rapidly the brain is developing, that the child is making sense of the world. And the child makes sense of the world through the experiences and the connections that the child is making as the brain develops. And is the child learning to make sense of the world using all the knowledge and experience the child has to make sense? So are there connections between the home culture experience and what the child is experiencing in the early childhood program? And is the child experiencing those connections and able to use them? This is an outcome for the child, able to use them to make sense of the world. And likewise, we know how important play is, and we would want the child to learn through play. All young children, I think Alison Gopnik at UC Berkeley has really done a wonderful job of making clear how that important that is based on very rigorous research. And so we want to make sure every child is experiencing that wonderful feeling of learning through play. And then over on the right side, physical development is so important. Is an outcome for the child building those small muscle and large muscle skills and being in a place where the child can do that. Is the child having opportunities to learn through learn language through regular communication with the care provider and the peers? And we know that language development is going to be fundamentally important for that child's success. Not only for learning to read later on, but we know it's connected to math knowledge, science knowledge, all of those areas. Having language and being able to use it well, all the language that you have. If you're a multilingual learner, all of those meanings that can come from that learning experience of those more than one language, that the child is having opportunities to do that learning and have regular communication, because we know communication is at the center of learning language. And finally, the child has confidence in using that home language to understand and learn about the world. And I think that's a very important outcome in the short term, that the child has that kind of confidence. So this is a suggested framework, and we can think about how we would work on a list like this, and you all can think about that and come to the first set of the kinds of those short-term outcomes from the point of view of the child's experience that we'll use to build and then see how that models to what we know about development and from research longer term, how that can inform us. Let's go to the next slide. We also need to focus on provider outcomes. And just like with the child, and I would say family, we want the same rationale for providers. They're important in and of themselves. So what would we want for every provider of our young children in California to experience in their work? How would we want to understand what they're experiencing? And then what do we know from research that shows us how providers can benefit from when those providers who are caring for young children? So again, we want research to inform us, but we also want to rely on what we know from experience and best practice. So let's take a look. I have a shorter list here. It's a starter list. This is to get the conversation going. But these are some examples, possible examples, just as they gave possible examples for the children. These are some possible examples for providers. Every provider is fairly and equitably compensated for work. I mean, we would want that for any workforce. In an essential workforce like this one, we have to get to this point. We're not there by a long stretch. We know that. I think self-care is very important. When we think about the work of someone working with young children, what research shows us, and Carolee Howell's research at UCLA has been very important in this regard, is we need our early childhood workforce who are working with young children to be able to make it, as part of their job, to make an emotional investment in the children they're caring for and the families they're connecting with and caring for and supporting. And to make that emotional connection, it's personally a really demanding job. And so we need to make sure an outcome of that work experience for providers is that they are practicing self-care. We want them to feel confident, respected, and valued, as we would want any worker to feel. And we want them to have opportunities, clearly defined opportunities that they understand and can connect with to build their knowledge and skills. And just to note, and this note is very important, we are focused first and foremost on the well-being and development of the providers. And by the way, secondarily, these outcomes, if this can be part of the experience of being a provider, we know there will be benefits for young children who are cared for by that provider. So, but that's not our motive for doing it. Our motive is we have a responsibility to make sure that every person in this public workforce and private, I know they're private nonprofits, every person has these kind of opportunities and experiences. So as I said, these are starter lists to get the conversation going. And it's a frame for how we can think about what outcomes we want to start with, and then we can talk about where we build it to. So those are my thoughts. I understand we have a few minutes here for questions, comments, and I can see that there are a lot in chat. I have to admit, I haven't multitasked here and looked at chat. I've been focusing on my words and the PowerPoint. So,
Peter. Yeah, thank you so much. This is a great way to be thinking about outcomes. And so I think we will just take a few minutes now for work group members. If you have questions for clarification, reactions, we will have time in the future as a work group to really go through these in terms of how to be thinking about outcomes together. But so for now, just to benefit from Peter being with us before we take a break, really welcome any questions or comments. And Verlinda, I see your hand. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. And I'm so glad to be here and to be able to be on so many different things. The PowerPoint was good. My concern is through this whole process we talk about the children and we talk about the provider and we talk about other links to the train as it goes on through the educational system. But the most important link that we're not talking about is parents. We need to get something in here for parents, because without the parents being the boost or the head of this train and getting the tools that they need and to give all the things that was stipulated on that PowerPoint just now, it has to start at home. It has to be rooted at home. It has to be continued going through home, because home is going to continue on to the rest of this child's life. We're only a link that comes in for a small length of time, and we can all do what we can do, but it has to be from the home also. So somehow, some way, please incorporate parents in this whole decision, in this whole planning, because if parents don't support the child is not going to go forward. And if the parents in them don't have a stable home environment, we're going to keep having these killings in these schools and things that we're going on now. it has to stimulate at home. And that's, we're taking everything from the home and putting it on everyone else. And I'm sorry, because I'm passionate about all of this, is because we're taking everything from the home and we're putting it on everybody else's back to take care of all of this. And we're only a link. It has to be at home. Home needs to have more responsibility. Home needs to be more supportive. Home needs more resources. Home needs a lot. So in order for this train, this boost, or this cable continue on, you got to do it from the house, because you house and you can go on to everything else. The children don't come to school and be happy they're doing the artwork for us. The children are not coming to school to say, hooray, I passed to the next grade. They're telling this to their parents, because their parents is their most important person in their life. And if we keep not ignoring the parents and their responsibility and what the roles that they're playing and how important their roles are, we're going to continue on having these gaps in these lines. Besides, we need benefits and we need retirement and we need all these other things for all the other links that help support these children.
So I wonder, Peter, if you have some reactions to that before we move on to Deborah.
Sure, I do. Berlinda, thank you for your comments, first of all. I completely agree with you that the family has the greatest impact on young children, and that connecting with the family is essential, and that the family is supported. I think within early care and education, we can give support, but it's a whole experience for the family, and there have to be other supports. And when we talk about young children and their success, and families with young children and their success, we need to think more holistically, not only say whole child, but actually make those connections and make it start working as a whole system. I focused on the early care and education part in this presentation, and I think we could easily add a list of what those experiences that we would want for families, and what do we know from research, as you're suggesting, and practice, and that we look at that list. And one thing I would suggest is, what can the early care and education field do directly, and then how can the early care and education field connect with other kinds of supports that we know should be there for families to make that experience that we all want for all families.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And Carla, thanks. I don't know if everyone's on the chat too. Carla's just reminding us that there'll be a real focus on parents and families in our next work group meeting. So it's very apropos. Deborah, I see your hand, and then Madi. So Deborah, please.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. And Berlinda, no doubt your words. Thank you for that. I have to honestly sit and say, this was a relief hearing you, Peter, because I felt that home-based educators were, in a positive way, spoken about, represented. And I appreciate the words of having been provided, being respected and valued. That was really some positive. It was great. So thank you for that, for pointing that out. It really does. And I am one of many and represent so many thousands. And I know that everyone on this call, when you were saying those words, and at least the ones who are home-based providers, was feeling that. So I want to say thank you for those words, because we do need to be respected and valued. And I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And thank you. That's how I feel. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. They are important. They are very important to all of us. And I don't think our system is close to recognizing that. And an outcome is, as you said, that they feel respected, valued, and they can be confident in who they are and how the world relates to them.
Thank you, Madi. I see your hand, and we'll check for other hands and then take a break. So Madi, please go ahead.
First, good morning, Peter. So great to have you here today. I wanted to share and echo some of the concerns that were outlined. I think from the beginning, I've expressed concerns about this child outcomes focus and how it puts an unrealistic pressure and responsibility on providers at a time that we're just talking about the baseline of keeping their programs open and what does it mean to provide, a baseline health and safety, right? And then the quality piece comes later. And we really do have a system that's that needs to be addressed so that providers have a referral system to connect the families to services. It's too big of a burden, and it's not realistic, again, to make sure that the provider is taking care of all of the issues that come to them first. So there has to be, this support system in place, the referral system in place. Not everyone can work at Head Start and have comprehensive services for families, right? So we need to make sure that families have access to that kind of support and that the provider has the support and they don't feel like they have to fix all of these issues, because that, again, is unrealistic. And if we keep putting the pressure on, we're going to continue that mass exodus that we're experiencing now. Several comments in the chat we're talking about, again, reminding us that family child care stepped up, that they were the ones open during the pandemic. They've already proved that they could do this work, especially in these extreme conditions. And so I just want to make sure that I bring it up again, that as we're discussing this whole process, this focus on child outcomes, again, needs to be appropriate and not putting too much pressure on the base. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. And I agree with you. And I think that's one of the tasks, is what can we realistically expect as we build the system of the providers currently. In my interactions with providers, and I'm fortunate to be able to, from time to time, have fairly extensive interactions, what comes across to me is their commitment to their work, their commitment to the children and to the families, and that they really want to put relationships with children first, and they're looking for help in how to do that. And I think that's where we want to start. I think we want to start with what can the provider do directly in the setting, and then, as you said, what connections then? It can't all be done by the provider, that we need a whole system to work around that child and family if we're talking about children's success in the long term.
Thanks, Peter. And Stephen, I see your hand. Why don't we take that as the last comment for now? Please go ahead.
Wonderful, thank you. So first, I want to appreciate Verlinda's comments. Certainly, as parents are the child's first educator, I think those are some great points. Appreciate the list here too. It's recognizing it's not a complete list, but it's certainly a good start. I know one of the things that we think about is, as we kind of work through this, how do we operationalize some of these things, right? Because I think that's an important kind of part of our part of our steps here.
I agree, and again, it's step by step, Stephen, and that's and I think all of you are in that place. We can't take some big idea with it all worked out and just try to implement. I think we have to build some agreements about what we're trying to support as a starting point, and then build it and learn from those big systems and how they work and the successes they've had. But we have a unique situation here, both historically and as a state, and we have tremendous passion, tremendous commitment, tremendous engagement, and everyone really wanting the best for our children, our families, and the providers who care for and support them. And so I believe we can get there, but I think we have to really be systematic and build up to it.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you so much for being with us today. And I've seen a lot of people express their appreciation in chat as well. Really wonderful, rich way to be thinking about these outcomes. And we will have more discussion about this as we move forward. We do have much more to do. And so we're going to take a quick break and start back at 10:05 if we could promptly. So quick stretch break. And we'll see you all at 10:05. Thank you.
Thank you all.
So we have about a minute left in our break. So thanks for those that are rejoining us. Hope that you got a little bit of a stretch in. We'll restart in about a minute. So hoping that people are back. It's 10:05 and I'd like to bring us back online. So if you're here, if you don't mind flashing your camera on so we can at least tell that you're back from the break. Great, thank you. Seeing a few people rejoin. And I'll just say before we move into the base rate, again, added appreciation for Peter. I feel like it's such a great reminder of what this is all about, which is people. And so being able to ground this in child outcomes, provider, family outcomes, and that reminder of the parent voice. So for Linda, thank you for raising that point. And as Carla said, we'll have that at our next session, but it really is about centering ourselves around how do we think of the system and what it supports in the way that it's anchored in child need outcome and supportive of those adults that are important to the care and learning and loving of children. So it just feels like a wonderful way to bring ourselves back to the base rate, and the reminder of this feels like it's about a lot of things, and it's about how to take care of very specific needs, but at the end of the day, how do we do that in the reflection of what it serves, which is those that care for children and the children themselves. So I'm seeing, I think, many faces reappearing. So I'm going to just proceed and presume that people are back in front of laptops and move us into this base rate. So we'll have about an hour to really dive more deeply into this. And really, I'll just say, we are revisiting our prior many months worth of conversation. So what I'd like to start this portion out with is some reminders that we've said a lot already. And now what it's time to do is start to synthesize that to some specifics and or options that we can utilize as we work to inform how to think about the structure of rates, as well as what comes together as a framework for a cost model. Okay, so they're very related, but they're also different. I mean, the charge of this group is to come up with an assessment and recommendations regarding a single rate structure. And so in doing that, we have identified the alternative methodology is something you want to see pursued, which is where the cost model comes up. So I want to, again, remind us of the relationship between those, but there's also an aspect of this that really is about the structures for the rate and our charge to be looking and assessing this aspect of the system. So I'm returning to some things that Gina shared with us, and the most recent iteration of this sharing was shared at our May 20th meeting, and that is, what do we mean by base rate? And these are the things that reflect our core standards, health and safety standards, requirements to meet licensing standards and other employment law, and then compensation above current wages. So one way I think you can think about this is, what are all the things that we say are required and or expected, and therefore how do we then pay for whatever that may include or involve, including notably compensation. And then what Gina had also shared is there could be things that you look at and say, that's the base, and we're going to complement that through enhancements. So there could be other things that we look at with regard to equity, quality variables, characteristics of child, program characteristics, provider, workforce characteristics, I'll throw out there. So, Gina's quote on this is on the right side, is that, it's it's really having a base of operations where we start. And that includes personnel and non-personnel, and some of the things of a specific call out on facilities, which this group has called out in prior conversations. So this is just a framing, or again, reminder that we've been talking about this, and in a very simplified view, here's what we need. You have had a lot of comments about what's a base rate as well. And so Karen and I, in preparing for this meeting, we went through all the prior meeting transcripts. And, I'll just say, having read through, I feel like it was maybe 100 pages of transcripts. I've decided that I'm not going to shop anymore. I'm just going to read these transcripts because, the conversations have just been so full in these meetings. And it really was, it's like watching a child grow. You don't notice day to day, but you do notice when you see the mark on the wall and each month goes by. And I think the way that this group has tackled these very complex issues, it was clear in the conversations how progress is being made by this group. So I just will, give you a few snips of things here in saying, you have elevated a number of very key issues when it comes to the base rate, and being able to be very thoughtful about methodology, being able to be inclusive about how it works, being able to reflect the need to think about the simplicity, but also the important nuances that need to be built and the connections that need to be brought. And I think this is one reason we had Peter sharing today, is how much do you presume, and this is somewhat to Mari's point about presume is needing to be present within that base for the various types of outcomes, or the way that we translate that into standards or quality, and what else might there be that we need to acknowledge or see in the system, which could be in this direct part of the base, but it also could be in other areas and aspects that we are working on in the system. So just a few. Again, we could have filled this up with, everyone had a comment that I think fit here. The other part then that we captured is what's missing and should be included. So a number of things that were raised in terms of the basis of operations, including equipment and supplies, being able to have a bit of, I'll say, insulation to challenges or circumstances that may arise. Planning time, transportation, it has been raised multiple times, the need to think about inclusion, dual language learners, potentially, and I think this comes up as we talk about target universalism and some of our differentiation of needs within communities. And, other comments around how do we look at, the real way that we start to manifest professional learning, but its relationship to how we pay, having adequacy of staff time, and in the whole system. So lots of things that you have acknowledged, recognized, and raised as wanting to see addressed that are currently either missing or inconsistent with what we notice in the current system. And then there's also, and this is where we get is, we talk about single rate, but recognizing that there is some differentiation within that. So what we're really doing is unifying what currently are separate rate structures into a single rate structure that still may have some factors that look a little different. So one of the things that's come up is, do we look at localized cost of living? We know that that is maybe different around the state. It may be different within counties. So some of the considerations that we may need to take with regard to, what is happening in areas that we see, types of programs that have different requirements, and that may translate into different ratios, that may translate into different standards, that may translate into different ways that we pay for and organize around. So that's going to be, I think a lot of parts of our conversation will be, how do we approach those areas where we may want to see some differences emerge, and how do we recognize those in a way that is clear to what we need to acknowledge through what's different, but also not making it overly complicated so that, we're making this a harder system to navigate. And then lots of additional considerations. that were put out that we've just tried to capture here on this slide. And, and I think the tensions that exist as we talk about how do we start to measure some of these pieces? How do we start to look at, what it means to, apply some structures to how we think of, I'll call it back to Carlise and in the equity of what it means to have vertical and horizontal equity in the system as we start to look at standards, requirements, experience of those that are part of the system. So those are, I think in your voice, the things that have gotten us to this moment where we can clearly look at these questions and say, okay, what do we mean by base rate? What is the base rate? And what may be complementing or adding to the base rate? Those are the three questions. And again, reminder about process. We put together some structure for you that's based on what you've already seen and heard for P5 as compared to New Mexico. And we're going to go through each of those. We have populated some clarifying questions, but we would like you to all kind of have that further questions, discussions. Karen and I will be keeping time so that we're going to ask, do we have a sense of some narrowing of options? And then sort of put a pin in that, move us through so we can get through each of these sections. And then at the end, we'll go back to them and we'll see if we can decide that we can center on an option or two. And then if you look at that and go, no, this is not the way it should be, tell us why. Tell us what needs to be different, okay? That would make it something that you could live with. And so we are going here for, looking at this with all trade-offs and tensions and trying to come up and navigate to the points of where we can come up with a practical solution to what we see as both a real challenge, but also a tremendous opportunity to put something together in the system. So just as like a reminder, and again, this is straight from the materials that P5 has previously shared about cost drivers. So when we talk about base rates and what they may be supporting, this is just a reminder of the things, and we've had lots of times to talk about those things that are personnel driven and non-personnel driven, and it's both a function of what it is and then how you start to size the cost based on how much of it there is. So these are just as a very broad overview and reminder of cost drivers. They shared with us last time, and actually in several of our meetings, model variables. So the things that go into their model include a variety of factors. These are, and for which their survey is collecting data so that they can start to model out these factors once we have some parameters or some definition around what's in and what's out of the model. So the last time we met, Gina shared with us and explained with Simon how two areas, New Mexico and District of Columbia, have approached their alternative model and or methodology and creating a cost model that had several base rate variables. This explains, what they shared with us. We had a lot of discussion about what we were seeing in some of the choices that these states made, and understanding more about each of these factors in the sense of what we could understand the practices or the ways that these states have taken this information. So this is just a reminder, okay? So this is something that was used to help us walk through how two places have gone through thinking of their base rate. What we have done is taken these variables and broken them down, and we just have, for the sake of this showing you and making this legible on the screen, we've just taken New Mexico because that's a state opposed to more of a locality, and thought New Mexico could be a good point of reference. So we're not trying to recommend New Mexico. What we're trying to do is remind us that New Mexico is a point of reference for each of these. And then we've put out a few questions that we think will help us try to identify what may be the options or directions that California could take with regard to each of these variables. So what we'd like to proceed with in the next 45 minutes or so is going through each of these, getting your full discussion, comments. We'll probably spend about 8 to 10 minutes on each of these and then move forward. And then we're going to revisit everything. Okay, so what we're trying to get to is, can we come up with what seems to be some options that we narrow based on some answers? And some of these we may not be able to answer today, and that's why we've added meetings in, and we'll have more time next week. So if we feel like we can't get there, and there's pieces though that you could identify that either would be helpful to this group coming up with clear options and making decisions, please note that for us. Okay, so any questions about what we're going to do next? Because what we have is, I think it's on 2 slides, right? It's 2 slides. We've been able to take these factors. We put out some questions. Those are the ones we'd like to start with, but we want to take any of yours and ideas that formulate into potentially these options. So questions, clarifying about process before we proceed here. Okay, well, let's go ahead and jump right in. So we move to the top of our list with you, compensation, because that's the piece that I think we've spent considerable amount of time, and we have a lot of interest in thinking about what should we have in our base rate as we reflect on what compensation should include. So we have broken this down into 2 parts. One is salary, the other is benefits. I just will call out for the benefits that there is a specific joint labor management committee that's focused on benefits. That's outside of the scope of the work group. We know that's of interest, so we just have this as a simple maybe yes, no question rather than a how question. Okay, so I just want to clarify the kind of putting some guardrails on that one. But for salary, that clearly is something that this work group needs to contemplate as it pertains to what should be acknowledged or recognized within the rate. So reminder, the way that New Mexico has approached this is they've included a minimum hourly rate. They've included a pre-K parity stipend. So this is considered something as an enhancement to the base. I know I'm being really simple here, but this is just as a sort of a point of reference there. I know there was some concerns raised by this group at our last meeting that the minimum hourly rate just seemed way too low. So one of the questions we have for this group is there a point of reference to a minimum hourly rate or some salary level or kind of way that you would say there should be some metric to this or not? And then I think the big question for us is, should we differentiate for cost differences based on regional or area differences? There was a comment made that's not being done in New Mexico because the view of New Mexico was it's the same work, so it should be the same pay. Now that may not be, that could be held as something we hold as true, or that could be something we say, well, but really the labor markets of California look different, or the needs, supply, demand, however you want to look at it. So those are the 2 starter questions that we'd offer. And I'm sure there are others amongst you, but I would just open it up for your comments, discussions. We're going to take, I think on this one, probably about maybe 10, maybe a little longer, since this is going to be one I think that's really important to our discussion. So Donna, please kick us off.
So I think that we have to take into consideration the hourly rate, minimum hourly, just because people have to hire based in that economy. And in some ways that drives some differentiation in regions because minimum wage varies in regions. You have a state minimum wage, and then you have some local jurisdictions that have separate minimum wage. But obviously our goal is not to have our providers paid at the minimum wage. This is skilled work and they should be paid above that, but it is a foundation in the cost structure.
So Donna, do you have any thoughts on what might be the way to create a point of reference? So it's not creating I think what I'm hearing you say is we need something to be clear about where the floor lies, but it should not serve as the ceiling.
Correct. And I'm not sure how you would factor minimum wage in, because Obviously, we don't want our providers paid at that level. I will defer to others to see if they have other ideas, but it is an indicator of the economy in which these programs are operating. You know, and I know one of the things we have been spending a lot of time looking at is, you know, our current rates are based on a survey done in 2018 when the minimum wage was $11 an hour. And the minimum wage is now $15 an hour and going up to $15.50 because of the inflationary trigger. And somehow that's got to get tied in, because you can't even hire, you know, a cook or aide or any, you know, can't keep up.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. It looks like we have a comment from Leah and then Deborah, and maybe we can see where we can think if there's any options that come up as we were having these comments. Leah and then Deborah.
Yeah, it is very complicated. And I think I would suggest that we look at a living wage as the floor, as a minimum wage for within this system. I do think that there does need to be some differentiation by region. And one way we could consider that is, you know, we can get a state living wage and we can get a local living wage. And so, you know, we could say, you know, across the state, the state living wage, we'd have to make some decisions about how you benchmark that, because there's different ways to, you know, we're looking at a person, you know, as single person, no kid, person with one kid, and those sorts of things. But a living wage, here's the state level, that's the floor across the state with some adjustment if there's a higher, if the living wage is above that in a particular region, but not to go below that. So that's one way I think that we can look at this. And I think that there's also, I just trying to figure out like what this means for staff in a program, like how we're talking about, you know, nobody working in a program should be earning below minimum wage. And then how do we scale up from there, looking at job role, you know, how do we benchmark family childcare to ensure that income coming in is enough to have a salary at a level that's equivalent to an administrator in a program, or I know New Mexico did lead teacher. So those also seem like important questions. But anyway, just to say, I think living wage is an important marker to use as a floor, and then establishing a wage scale so that we have a way to go up from there and know where we're going and how to account for that. And to the question of benefits, just on the yes, no, like yes, absolutely, yes.
Okay, thanks, Leah. So putting forth the idea or the option of having some reference to living wage with wage scale or regional adjustments that are no less than, and so they just scale up, and then some differentiation based on roles or types that we see and need to accommodate. So Deborah and then Eric.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm totally thinking, how do you include, you know, you say this minimum wage, hourly wage in here. So I'm also saying and thinking, there's no living wage for a subsidized provider or even a private provider if there's no children. You know, so where would they be there? What do we do? So I'm totally like in my thoughts of, well, of course, need I say it? Increase the rates, period. And I mean, I don't know what more to say, but we've got to increase the rates. And then if you want to put an inclusion in there, such as for providers, an additional rate for providers who, I mean, I don't know, I don't know. I just really think you have to increase the rates, period. You just really need to increase the rates because, you know, you're correct, Donna, what provider, such as myself, are going to work as hard as I do, and my overnight kids, et cetera, on a minimum wage. You're not going to give me, I can't take an hourly rate. That would be ridiculous for me. I couldn't survive. A home-based provider couldn't survive. So I just increased the rates. So that's my first comment. Maybe I'll have more and more thoughts, but
okay.
That's that. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Deborah. And Eric.
Echo what Eric Sonnenfeld said a few times, and I think you had down in writing that we do have a market failure, not only in the state, but in the country. So if we address these needs for our subsidized families, it may cause a ripple effect in the private market. And I think it's important to say out loud, like, we can't, as advocates, say out of one side of our mouth that our providers aren't getting paid enough, and out the other side of our mouth say childcare is too expensive. Those things don't go together. We have to stop saying those things. The way where civilized countries address this is the federal government steps in and realizes that in order for their economy and their society to operate properly, they need to compensate their early care workforce, and that they need to subsidize it all the way up to the middle and high middle income people. And so I know this work group isn't here to change everything for the whole world, but I think it's just important to realize those things. And in the meantime, we have work to do to support what Donna was saying about us trying to scaffold a rate that's from 2018 that's wildly out of proportion, that is causing a market collapse right now. So I think that, again, this work group needs to present stuff to our administration and show the urgency of the need to get these rates increased to a reasonable level so that the whole market doesn't collapse.
Okay, good point. So let me take what I think is an easier piece here. Does anyone feel that there should not be differentiation by some regional or area factor in the rate? And if so, could you kind of help us understand why a statewide rate would be the approach?
Stephen, did I see your hand or did you lower it? Okay.
I did after I reheard the question in my head. I heard that it was why we should not, and I'm not going to advocate for having a statewide rate. Okay. Regional differences is what makes sense. It's certainly, when we think about simplifying the system, and I'm thinking back to the quotes that you showed on the screen earlier, and from Donna's earlier comment about differences in LA County, it's hard to see a way we can simplify the system while also kind of capturing those differences in rates in counties. But yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Okay, so so I was like giving you the double negative question. So thanks, Stephen, for sussing that out. But thought it was too easy to ask you if y'all agreed that we should have some differentiation. But Eric Sonnenfeld and then Mari.
So I'm going to kind of split the issue in half. So wherever we regionalize things, we need to be mindful of wherever that line is, we are decreasing the buying power or the access to certain things wherever those lines are drawn. So that is the flip side of a regionalized rate, because there's different buying power that rate achieves in different counties, and parents have different access depending on where they live. And so if we're trying to build an equity model across the state and have equity standards, we just need to be mindful of that. That could be a slippery slope. And wherever those lines are drawn, there's always going to be somebody on the wrong side of that line.
Fair and important point. Mari.
So I guess I would advocate for the statewide rate because, to my points earlier, the cost of education are the same for anyone. So for me to live in a place that maybe is considered a region that should be reimbursed lower, I still pay the same rate to get my college units and training and travel and blah, blah, blah. The cost for materials from Lakeshore or wherever else are the same. Healthcare rates don't account for region necessarily. And really the big difference is the housing and the space rent and things like that. So having worked for 3 different districts myself and being paid at different rates has been difficult because I'm bringing the same skills, expertise, education to the table. My costs are still the same, things like that. So again, the adjustment has to be made, I think, more for the space, and closures have told us that that's what's right now the biggest impact. So I did want to share that piece. And again, just like the base rate enhancements, would there be an enhancement somewhere?
Okay, thanks, Mari. Gina, yeah.
Hi all, just thrilled to hear the work group's perspective on these elements of base, but just wanted to jump in on a process perspective there. One particular thing of this process of building a cost model and making a decision on regional or statewide, even in the case of New Mexico, they waited until they were actually seeing the cost model's outputs to make that final decision. So weighing in now and thinking through some of those very valid things that Mari just raised, for instance, is certainly helpful, but I would still say, I would suggest that we reserve until later in the summer when we actually have a functioning cost model and we're seeing what some of those variances in say living wage, how that plays out. There may not be as much variation across some of the regions as you may be thinking right now. And when you have the outputs from the model, it'll be another decision point, another help for that decision point.
Thanks, Gina. And I think that's absolutely a good point of like, we can know more as we move through this. I think one of the, points that has been made around the difference between the systems that we have right now is one has the regional market piece and wanting to see that. But I think your point is well made, which is you may not see that the same way if you really move towards some different structure of this. So I think that's a helpful reminder. These are not one and then the other. It's actually related to each other. So, but we wanted to see where the group was sort of coming. What I'm hearing right now is, from the group is what we have reflected based on the current market survey is not adequate in that it's too low. So something above where that has landed is going to be important. That the notion of a living wage, and thanks Dean for adding the reference to MIT's work, but that perhaps what we can do is come back to what that might look like. It's giving you further, more detailed references to something. If we can start looking at different ways to reference how you would apply to a living wage, that there needs to be some ability then to create that as a reference that you can scale to what differences we may see in the system. And that there is, at least preliminarily, sort of a thought of we may need to adjust this to regions or areas, but Mari's made the point as a person has been in multiple places, your costs may not be different in terms of your inputs of education. And so therefore, why make the rate different? So is there any other additional comments that you'd like to make before we move to the next area? And again, we'll revisit this to say, like, anyone want to put out some specific options or requests so we can come back to our next meeting?
Janelle, I just wonder, and I see Eric's hand, I just wonder if, like, even if it's in the chat, you'd like everyone to weigh in on the should benefits be included? Because I know just some individual work group members happen to bring it up, but whenever you feel ready to.
Okay, yeah, no, I'll go to benefits next, Karen. So I just wanted to we're dealing with just salary at the moment.
Yep, great.
But so Eric and then Verlinda.
So this is a clarity question from my own mind. Is whatever rate we're going to come up with, is it going to be a per child rate or some other equivalent? Because I think that will drive a lot of our calculation and result thinking, because I think that's a Gordian knot that we're wrestling with to figure out if this is a per child rate, we are talking something slightly different than a general base rate to support an individual business owner, if that makes clarity sense. So I just need some clarity for myself going into
and
these
maybe
discussions.
Eric, can we revisit that question when we get to ratios and group size?
Sure.
Because I think this is the ratio group size. Is there a standard like ratio reference? In which case, does that become the whatever you decide is the standard of comp and then the standard of rate, and then that establishes the standard of operations, and kind of it's a multiplier divider kind of question. So let me hold on that question because I think you're asking a good question that those two are very much related. So Verlinda?
I was on the same line as Eric. I'm sorry, because right now with our regional market rate, we don't get paid if the children don't come to us. And if you're looking at it, are we looking at it where we still get paid regardless because we are contracted for that slot, the parents in there, or how that is going? Because right now, you're asking for the minimum wages. That means we're getting in this position, and it's like, okay, no matter what, once you sign on and you're agreed to, this is how much you're going to be paid on a daily, weekly basis with nonstop, unless you go on vacation or whatever. And then that's benefits, which jumps in and take the place of that. But for providers, because we don't have that in the place right now, it's kind of hard to say what is the minimum and what is the maximum, because we only get paid for the attendance of the child, not enrollment.
Okay, so, and let me just say that's something that, and we put this into the draft, that this group has been clear. You'd like to see the funding be based on enrollment, not on attendance for the future. So let's, I'm going to sort of presume, well, if you have changed your mind on that, let us know. But I think that's an agreement we've had that would be carried forward. So as you go through this, imagine that these are additional, the way you approach these variables is with that presumption in mind. That is, we're moved to enrollment-based funding for the system. And now, how do we address these other variables? So thank you for reminding of that, Verlinda. Okay, so I'm going to put a pin in the compensation for salary piece. We've unpacked a few things, a lot of questions that we'd have, and you can see how these do get related to one another. So just a quick one on benefits, and I think this is, I'm presuming, going to be an easy point of agreement, but wanting some recognition that benefits are included within base rates, or some way of addressing benefits. So is there anyone that's opposed to wanting to make sure that there is some reflection of benefits in anything established for the base?
Belinda, when you say yes in the chat, yes, you object to having benefits in the base, or I assume you're saying yes, benefits should be in the base rate.
It should be included.
Okay, just to clarify, thank you.
So I guess the other clear way for me to ask this is, does everyone agree that benefits being part of the base is where you're at as a position? And if you disagree, let us know why and how, what you would offer as an alternative or option.
Okay, not hearing opposition or alternative.
Okay, so we will put forward that there needs to be some reflection of that. We know there's another group working on that. So it's just, I would say, your validation that whatever that group is working on, that this group is, reinforcing it, that's important. Okay, so let's talk about the next one, which is ratios and group size. So this is where Eric's comment comes into play here around, the question being, when we come up with a rate of pay, your rate of pay, if it's based on a per child amount, you would want to know then, is there a minimum standard for the per child amounts, or is there like are we talking about what become the standards for those ratios to determine how we establish what is the way that a per unit goes into a total comp or a compensation of the salary calculation. So the question here, and you can see what New Mexico did, is they said, well, our ratios and group size are going to be predicated upon meeting state licensing standards. So our question to this group is, should current program standards be the point of reference? And we look at those ratios, does that then establish what we look at, and then how or should, is a related question, the small family childcare ratios be what we use for a reference for family, friend, and neighbor, or is there some other reference? So Eric Peterson.
I think it's probably important for the group and the public to maybe make a slide differentiating what the difference is between the true cost of care and the recommendation on how we reimburse providers, because they're two different things. The hope is that they would equal each other, but the reality is that it's not going to happen right away. And so I think it's just important because it's confusing to people who don't really understand what the work of the work group is. Cost of care, true cost of care versus how we recommend providers get reimbursed. And then what are the factors that we use to decide how we reimburse? Is it going to be group size ratio, credits? What is it? I just would put that out there because I believe that could be confusing for people.
Thanks, Eric. And we will work on that. I think what you're raising is there's the things that we refer to as the rate, and then there's a lot of the details that come into how do we take what we know to be factors of true cost of care and translate those into then a actual rate. And so I think what we're trying to point out is some of those factors are here in terms of how you define what may be, reference points to how we establish what will go into determining the cost of care, and then how we translate that back into what we pay on an hourly basis or we pay on a unit basis, however that might be. So we can work on that explanation. So I'd ask any other comments, questions about, as we do this, what goes into this base rate, how do we view ratios and group size? Is it the structures we have right now of current program standards? And if so, we have a gap there for our family, friend, and neighbor care. Should that be the reference to small family child care? So Deborah.
Truth be told, I don't know personally how it's even calculated. So I'm reading this. Should current program standards be point of reference? And should the small family child care ratios be used for family? And I'm like, well, I don't even know how that works. So I'm like, what does my comment come from? Or I have no understanding. I don't know this part. So you guys know. I mean, there's those on this work group that know exactly how this works. But there's, again, as he was saying, those on this work group has no idea how, I can't even think of how to figure it in because I don't know how to do it from point one. So that's why I need help in order to me to fairly give any input or have any understanding of what this means. I need another breakdown.
So is there anyone from the work group that would like to volunteer to describe or to explain how the present structure is with regard to program standards and what that means in terms of ratios?
And remember the public too, those on the public call who have no idea how that works. Thank you.
So I'll say that in our, I want to say it was the May 8th or somewhere in the early May meeting, we had some materials that were shared that laid out some of the differences in the current program standards and ratios based on age and setting or program type. And so that's what I'm referring to here. And at that meeting, we agreed that it was important to think about, there are some differences in program standards based on the age of children, based on the program. And so, as we looked at it, the role of ratios and group size, if we're basing that as like the true cost, those numbers, so when you have one adult and 4 kids, it's different than one adult and 10 kids in terms of what may be a per child rate. If you are trying to get to, well, I'm trying to get to a certain level of compensation is my target.
Right? I got it now. I recall. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So Leah, comment or help with explanation?
I'm there. Thank you. I've got it now. Thank you.
I had a comment. I didn't have any.
Please go ahead.
Explanation. I think it would be confusing to introduce another set of standards for ratios from what already exists. I mean, I think there could be reasons to do so, but I think it would just be confusing. It would be adding another layer. And many programs are serving a mix of kids who have subsidy and kids who don't have subsidy. So what would that mean if they now have a different ratio imposed on them, but aren't getting the same reimbursement rate for other children in their program or something like that. I don't know. It just seems very confusing to me. So I can't in my head figure out how that would work. And to the question of family, friend, and neighbor and small family childcare, that just seems confusing to me. I'm not exactly sure.
So the point there is right now we don't have a reference. We don't have a standard reference to a ratio for how to, we don't have a family, friend, and neighbor ratio standard, group size standard. So the question is in trying to put together some way of looking at the base rate, is there a reference that we could use? And would small family childcare be a reasonable reference to that? So just putting that forward as just a question as well as an option. So, but let's hear from Eric and then see if others have comments and questions.
Yeah, this is the part I want to hit on because this is very important. This ratio is how this is going to calculate per child, if that's the methodology we're going to use moving forward for the base rate. And this is a very important discussion. And to kind of paint the picture in everyone's mind, the base rate, of course, should be differentiated based upon the modality, I think. And so I think we talked about that before. Family, friend, neighbor, family, child, licensed family care, center-based, and so on. So to quickly illustrate the differences, and we all know this, but currently family, friend, neighbors do not have any current regulation at all. Family child care homes have roughly 50 pages of regulations and no technical requirement for provider education. There's many providers who go above and beyond and have more education than is necessary or required per Title 22. Child care centers have 194 pages plus additional education requirements for staff. Title V centers have those 194 pages of regulations plus a couple hundred other pages beyond licensing requirements. So you can see how the system is layering on top of itself different requirements that come with a cost. And those are based upon a cost per child. But if we're going to try to create an infrastructure system in the state of California and make sure that a family, friend, neighbor provider has, I hate to use the word livable wage, has a relatively fair wage to incentivize them enough to be part of the system to provide childcare. Doing it on a per child ratio is going to be somewhat difficult because if you're only taking care of one child, is that going to be a going concern from a business point of view? My guess, it's probably not going to be. So what are we assuming that there's going to be multiple children in a provider's home that are subsidized utilizing this rate? Or are we not? And it gets back to that big question about our ripple effect into the private pay world. Are we going to be forcing providers to move into the subsidized market because that's where the quote unquote guaranteed relatively fair amount of reimbursement is, because the private pay market is not able to bear that.
So Eric, can I ask, I think you're pointing out that we have to, by trying to fix one part, you actually could create unintended consequences in another part of the system, and that ultimately we don't have a state, 100% state funded system. So we have to deal with the fact that parents still make contributions. And so your point is, if you pay in an outsized way here, that the tension of like, can parents even afford that may not be eligible for subsidy. So can you kind of frame what you would say an option is? I mean, I think and maybe another way for me to pose this to you is, I mean, are you saying that if you have one child or you have 4 children, it's not possible to pay people the exact same amount? Or
correct.
Is it?
Well,
okay.
What's going to happen is if you make one child equivalent as a living wage, as you have multiple additional subsidized children, that's going to be a great revenue generator. And I'm not opposing that at all. However, that is going to balloon the costs significantly to the system, because you're going to spread those subsidized children around the world, around the community, which I think is great and give huge opportunity to all providers. But I think we have to develop whatever that base rate is per child, that there's an incentive built in to take 1 or 2. Because if you're a family, friend, neighbor provider, you're taking care of one family. Is that going to be a fair compensation for doing so? Because they are also an important part of the infrastructure as well. So I didn't answer your question directly, Janelle, because I think we need more time to chat about it. And I think we need to see what some of the results from the actual cost model are before we go there. But that should be a touch point when we go into those discussions about what the actual cost model produces.
So I think what you're describing, Eric, is sort of a sensitivity analysis of like,
yes,
is there some point it's just too small of a group to say you can create a practical subsidy model,
right?
And it's so take maybe a starting point of license standards and then something less than licensing standards, and say, do we have a tolerance for a system that would look like that?
Correct.
Could we still sustain the private market with a system that looks like that? Is that what I'm hearing? Okay.
Yes.
Anyone, I think this is like the kind of conversation we were hoping we'd have today. So anyone have a response, reaction to what Eric is saying? I mean, which is the question of, at a certain point, is more than one child, then what, where's your floor on the ratio? So Eric.
I think
Eric Peterson.
Verlinda was first, actually.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm covering up. I have so many windows open. So Verlinda, then Eric. Sorry.
Hello, everyone again. I think what makes this complicated again, because let's get an understanding. Centers can take 14 to 24 children. A small family child care can take 6 to 8. A large family can take 12 to 14. And a family friend can take 1 or maybe 6 kids, but it's only one family. So the variations of how the size of children can come into the facilities and be cared for is what's going to make this complicated. Because if we're looking at that, a base rate is kind of hard because, like say for instance, a large can take only maximum of 4 infants and maybe 4 toddlers and 2 school agers, where a center is just specifically 3 to 4 year olds or 4 to 5 years old, so that the ages ranges is different, the price ranges is different between those. So that's also what family and friends, because they don't have all the requirements that a licensed facility has to go through, they're below the pay rate. So each one of us is like a different step, as he was explaining, of a pay rate. So that has to be in consideration. And like the other gentleman before that was saying that we need to show an example of the differences of how each one is getting paid and which one is entailed, would be able to give everybody an insight on trying to make these decisions instead of talking about it now, because it's too complicated, because everybody don't know what's entailed in each area.
So thank you for that point, Verlinda. I think this is giving us some points of where to maybe start with the point of reference, which is take our standards and then take them less and then start to put them together in ways that connect what we're saying about wage level and then giving everyone something to react to, so that it doesn't, we're taking some of these moving parts and putting them into more of a packaging of things. So appreciate your comment about complexity and trying to get to a place where we can start to see what this might look like so we could have some comparison there. So Eric Peterson.
Well, it's interesting because currently we have a model that suppresses rates. And we have regulations that say you, as a provider, can't charge more for your subsidized child than you can for your market rate child. And so that's kind of a difficulty. If this thing went through and we paid true cost of care, we'll just dream for a moment. What you would have then is, say, a family child care provider with 12 having 4 kids that are making twice what the private market pays, which would flip this on its head, which is just interesting. And I don't know even what that means, but it's just something to think about. Part 2 about exempt care, Eric Sonnenfeld, absolutely correct that with hundreds of pages of requirements and documents and regulations that these center-based programs have, when you line it up to an exempt provider, it seems inequitable that the exempt provider would be getting paid close to what the Title V program was. But what the market shows us is that those exempt providers on the open market are getting paid way more. And so it's interesting to me, like, what kind of work are you going to do to pull down how much in the private world the exempt childcare providers are making? And what does that mean? I mean, and how do we deal with that? So it's just, for me, it's kind of a thought experiment, but it's something worth looking into.
Okay, thank you for recognizing that this is like mental gymnastics as we try to think through all of this here. Any other comments before I move us along? And again, we'll come back to this. I'm clear we're gonna, what we work through today, we'll be coming back to at our next meeting as well. So we're just trying to see if there's some ways to start thinking about how you want to see the base rate built and what kind of feedback would be useful to making those decisions. So what we've unsurfaced so far is any kind of points on where you want to see compensation with regard to salary has a relationship to where we see ratios falling, needing to be mindful that we can use program standards currently as they are as a reference point, but then seeing where, if it's going to be based on those per child amounts as the model, we also want to see then what the sensitivity is to smaller group size, larger group size, to make sure that it's fitting with, where you feel comfortable how that model should be working, or some, or is there some other unit mechanism that needs to be thought of? Leah brought up the point of it's already pretty complicated, so maybe thinking about not changing program standards at this point, but using that as our current reference as we think about what this build out may look like. Okay, so let me move to the next one, which is professional development support. So this is one where the New Mexico model builds in hours of professional development time for that's differentiated based on those in centers and those in family child care. This is built in as some hours that are then addressed in the compensation. There is no planning time in their model, so the questions for the group that we'd ask for your consideration is, should professional learning or training be included with the base, or is it as an enhancement? So right now, a lot of our programs, and this came up earlier, we have stipends for things, we have outside payments, we have programs that provide support. So how do you want to think about where professional learning sits and training sits? What then would be expectations for professional development or planning time that inform the amount of coverage? So this gets to, I think this came up at the last meeting, and Donna had made a comment about the ability to measure things as a means to have some rationale for when money is there, how it's being used. And then are there differences? So as you can see in New Mexico's example, there's a differentiation based on centers from family child care. So is there some differentiation based on type of program? So those are the starter questions that we have for you as we think about professional development. I think this is one that has been called out by the group as not only professional development, but coaching, planning time. So what are your thoughts as you think about how the base is connected to professional development within a system we want to see for California? Gina.
Just one point of clarification that may help the group to get to more of the substantive enhancements. The hours that are referenced there for New Mexico, and this exists in California too, having built other cost models and throughout areas of the state, there are hours that are required training in licensing. So that is what is in their base. And that is something that we would recommend is in your base because it is about meeting licensing. The question then becomes more about having additional hours beyond those required in licensing or other supports like coaching, planning time, whether those are in the base. So you have hours of PD that are required in order to meet licensing every year for both centers and family childcare homes. And that should be sort of set off to the side. And then what do we want to go beyond that?
Great. Thank you, Gina. That's really helpful clarification. Dean, you have a comment.
Just to kind of get the conversation started, one of the things that I know teachers have to do, 125 hours or 120 hours over 5 years and equates to about 21 hours a year of professional development time. I think that can be kind of a start for the conversation about how many hours we're looking at. As for it being included in the base rate, I think it should be because sometimes they have to pay for those hours or they have to buy materials for those courses, or if they have to take time off or close their program to go take those hours. I think it's important that we compensate them for that. And then I'll say from a personal experience, I know many of my teachers were actually using their vacation time to go take their 21 hours of unit because they couldn't be paid for working and then have to take professional growth hours for their renewal of their CD permit. I just felt that that was wrong. So we changed some of those things around within our district, but maybe that's a good place to start talking about how many hours are required. And then I thought also that last comment around they have to do like AB 1207, they have to do CPR classes, they have to do, there's a bunch of other hours that are rolled in there that are part of their PD or part of just health safety for the center. So I think those are all things that need to be considered and also should be included in the base rate because we can't ask people to close to do those things and then not pay them.
Thanks, Dean. And I think you're describing is what's required under CTC permit license renewal is the amount of time there. And that being I guess related to, but not entirely exclusive of the program requirements of licensing standards, but you bring up another dimension of that. So thank you.
Yeah.
Reactions to Dean's comment or to this just general area. So what Gina clarified is New Mexico's approach is saying what's required in licensing. Let's make sure that those are covered. Dean has added additional comments with regard to there's renewal and CTC and what he is seeing amongst the teachers that are at his district's centers. Deborah.
Thank you. I was going to just say, as far as you said, should it be as an enhancement, meaning that a provider, home-based provider, if you do more hours or beyond, that's what you mean, that they'll receive an additional fee or additional reimbursement? Janelle, is that what you mean when you say?
Yeah, I think that's the question is what do you count in the base and what else may need to be addressed? And that being, beyond that base, what should there be some way of looking at the way we think about, the additional enhancements being present to support additional learning or planning time or, what have you.
I think it should be a part of the enhancement.
Okay.
That's how I see that. Thank you.
I would also recommend that the work group request that all those costs are free. I mean, you shouldn't have to pay for health and safety. I know there's money for it now, but I don't think it pays for everybody. Also, if you're actively involved in the early childhood field, the education should be free. The book should be free. Those things should all be paid for. Like there's other models that do that. So I think that's important. And the time.
Stephen, I saw your hand.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to echo kind of Dean's comments. Like that shouldn't be part, like having to use VATE. It shouldn't be, that should not be our model, right? We should have, I think it makes sense to have professional development in the base rate. It certainly is a way to support and elevate the entire system so that we're benefiting all children in all of our settings, not just those that say get subsidies. So strengthening the system for all.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Leah.
I was going to say something similar to Stephen. I definitely think support for PD should be included in the base. I don't think that precludes it from being included in the enhancement, that there can be additional and maybe, anyways, I think there can be additional hours or for specialized topics or trainings or things like that that can also be included in an enhancement. But I do think supporting professional development, because we know people have to do it, they're doing it, is a really important part of people's jobs, and so accounting for that. I think the question here on planning time, which it says New Mexico included no planning time. I also think that's really important. That seems like some of that's professional development, but planning time is also just your planning time, right? To plan your program on a daily basis, a weekly basis. So I'm not sure that should land under professional development, but seems a really important part of staffing levels and making sure that there's, adequate time paid for to account for, planning. And so that seems very important. I'm just not sure it lands under professional development.
Okay, thank you, Leah, for the comment. So what I think, there's an aspect of this that it sounds like people have put forward is the things that are required of providers should be included in the base. There may be some, there also is a need for some enhancements that allow for the additional learning. It may be something that you want to see some time for. We don't know what the basis would be yet, but there is some acknowledgement that could include both the learning as well as planning. But it sounds like, if it's required, let's make sure it's recognized. Let's make sure, I think Eric Peterson just said, let's make sure it's paid for, as so people can have access to it. I'm going to move us forward because I know we only have about 15 minutes. We want to give some time to public comment, and this does address some of the other factors that have come up. So one of them is non-teaching personnel. So there is, in the New Mexico model, some assumptions around what would be provided beyond the classroom. And so this is for the programs of a director, assistant director, administrative assistants. Just a question to this group around, do we see those as the position, what type of position should be included in the base rate for California? Are there differences based on setting? And that includes size or type of program that should be accounted for. So anyone want to kick us off with a comment about this? Deborah.
I guess I will, if I'm reading this. So in the base rate, if I'm a large capacity home-based provider, then I would have to make sure that there is let's say the director of the home base will be myself, and then the assistant, at least an assistant. So if I'm large capacity, those providers, that should be considered at least 2 people. If you're a small capacity, of course, then that base rate would be 1 person. But if you're, at that would be, again, the base rate. In the base rate, coming in as a large capacity. Now, again, that conversation goes will be different if we're going over the base. So I'm going to keep my mind straight on the base rate, entry rate. So yeah, at least 2 for home-based educators.
So I'm hearing you say, Deborah, that the size of program may be a factor that affects this, and that at our larger sizes, we would see this as something that should be part of it, and maybe at our very small, not something that is included in the same way. Okay.
Absolutely, it's definitely right. Definitely got to be considered in that base, right?
Okay, and then Dean?
I was going to say, yeah, I think that's a good idea. And I'll just use us as an example. We currently fund a lot of those positions that are out of the classroom, you know, like our directors, or we call them early ed center principals, our office managers and things like that, out of our targeted student population fund. So we have to write them into our LCFF. But I know not everybody has that. And so part of me says that if we can fund that through a base rate, then it also reduces the encroachment that we have to take from LCFF, and we can redirect those dollars to other places that are also needed. So I do think it's something that should be considered.
Okay, thanks, Dean. So what you're describing is in K-12 school districts where you have distributed programs, you're having to blend funds. And so trying to say, well, let's recognize this as part of the true cost, because you're basically blending funds from other sources within your system to support that. Is there anyone that has another perspective about it? Sounding like for our larger programs, we want to see something included that let's acknowledge that there's a real cost of doing business, or true cost, maybe, and some differences that may exist for small programs. So for Linda, Donna, and then we'll move on to non-personal expenses.
Okay, my question is because we are a childcare home, and we're looking at this as a base rate and everything. Should we be also considering if we want to hire someone in other positions, like a cook or a landscaper or something like that, that should be listed under this non-teaching personnel? Or are we just looking at what we're currently having now, which we cannot afford, and what we can afford?
So that's a great question. And again, Verlinda, I'm giving you as a point of reference what New Mexico has. What I'm hearing you say is there are non-teaching personnel that extend beyond the types of positions that have been just listed. So there could be others that it sounds like you're raising up that could be support positions that affect I guess, are you suggesting that you'd like to see something in the model that is some non-teaching personnel positions that have a greater range than what you're seeing the New Mexico example? Can you give me a little bit more of what you're looking at here or thinking about?
Yes, like right now, I'm assuming they made this what they have now, but we have providers in them who are trying to go beyond that and have a staff, and maybe looking at the future of transitioning to a large center or something, and to be able to have that experience, to be able to work with these different people. They probably can implement that now in their facilities now as directors or assistant directors to get that experience and everything. So can we add that in there, or can we look at that, or are we just looking at what is present now and what we got and what we can work with right now?
I think, Verlinda, what we're asking is what should it be in the future, and what would we want to see as the type of positions that are reflected in a base rate? And perhaps, I mean, is what you're describing the base, or is it an enhancement where you'd say this is something that we see that some programs may want to have access to, or is it something that we want to see all programs reflected in the rates? And are there reasons to have differences, right? So that's really the question for us, is not how it works presently, but what is it that is we're moving particularly into thinking about the true cost opposed to the market rate. So I see Donna nodding your head. I wonder if you want to help build on Verlinda's comment.
I was going to add to that.
Okay.
I think that as we look at alignment across funding types, a lot of the non-teaching personnel is already included when you write a Head Start proposal. And our Head Start grants pay for a wide array of non-teaching personnel, from cooks and people who do support, but also mental health support and family resource folks who can work with families on different support services. When you write a Head Start proposal or a Head Start grant, and I see Dean nodding because I know he's done these too, you include all that in. That's all baked in. And when we start thinking about alignment across programs and whole child, whole family services, I think that that's a model we have to consider in this space.
Okay, thank you, Donna. That's a great point and another point of reference that we can bring back into this space. Okay, I'm going to move us through here. Non-personnel expenses, these are things that have come up in a variety of ways. I think it even further came up today with regard to, family engagement, but we've in the past talked about transportation, facilities, materials, supplies, etc. Are there things that anyone here would like to add in terms of non-personal expenses and what you foresee being part of California's recognition of the base rate? Are there other types of expenses that you would like to see that would be funded perhaps through additional enhancements? So question of base rate, and then also question of enhancements. And I'll give you an example. It could be it sits in both. So there might be a factoring of occupancy generally for facilities, but we still may say that we need an enhancement for facility modernization or construction. That would be something that is treated as an outside grant for those kinds of purposes or outside loans for those purposes. So it's not to say they need to be exclusively one or the other, but there could be pieces that are very complementary between the base and other mechanisms to provide enhancements. Donna.
I think that for things like enhancements that are short term, you could do, short-term grants. I think about facility renovation, facility, we've gone through a lot of changing over Head Start facilities to serve younger kids. I mean, those types of things, those things cost money, but they're short term. And then some of these other things like family engagement and nutrition and assessment seem more long-term or ongoing to me. So I think we might have to differentiate that long-term ongoing is more part of the base, and that the short-term one-time investments would need to be, that could be done with grants or one-time money. So it seems like it depends what the type of thing is.
Okay, I see a lot of nodding on that. So thanks, Donna, for raising that. Deborah?
I want to say, if I'm not mistaken, in how it works in New Mexico, is the home-based providers cannot charge in their rates gas, materials, activities, things of that nature, because it's already built in the base. So making sure I'm clear on this. This is about being built in the base. The supplies and the gas, et cetera, yes, should absolutely be built in the base. So it should not be excluded. That's important for home-based providers. Thank you.
So I hear what you're saying, I think, is some of that operating expense that's ongoing and you wanting to see that in the base. Okay.
If I might jump in with maybe a better example of how a non-personnel expense can vary from the base to other enhancements. To Deborah's point, all of these things are baked into the base on how a program runs and would operate day to day, year to year. You may have educational materials in that are sort of at the base, quite literally, but then you may also want your model to have in it a enhanced version of educational materials that say, if a program's using a STEM curriculum or a handwriting curriculum or a literacy, and that would be more annually than the base educational materials, but you would always have educational materials in the base. There'd be a scaffold on top of that at different levels within the cost model. And that's an example of an annual operating versus that short-term investment in, say, construction or a facility. Those are sort of two different things when we think about that idea of annual operating. And Deborah's correct that when you're building your base, you want to make sure it covers all of those annual operating, that they're all in there so folks aren't having to ask for other money just to run day to day.
Thanks, Gina. I think that's an important clarification, and that's, that distinction between ongoing or the day-to-day versus the short-term or new requirements. Those are distinctions that we can see why you would want to have something in the base and then something ready to complement it in enhancements. So I'm mindful of the time, and I'm mindful that we're actually going to meet in a week. So I'm going to table talking about inclusion in special needs because I think that's more than we have time for, but it's something we need to build on. I would like to circle back, and what I would propose is that when we come back to our next meeting, we start where we're ending here, which is to come back and I'm already hearing some pieces that we can bring forward as maybe some examples or reference points. So as we go back to this with compensation, I think what the group really talked about here is thinking about this not from the minimum hourly wage, but recognizing that there's a living wage reference that would be thinking about how to create that, understanding the need to have some benchmarks for this and wanting to get perhaps some additional ideas of how we create that benchmarks, and that there needs to be a thought of, if you start with the living wage, where and how does it scale through the system? There was general agreement that needing to think about this from regional or area differences, but not complete. So the notion of people come with what they have. How do you make sure that you recognize the similarities of what it is required in training and how that works? And so, and then I think Gina bringing forward, we may want to look at this more closely as we create the model, because you may find that needing to have area or regional differences diminishes as we start to see how this plays out in terms of where we get to with regard to wages. So it's more of the sensitivity to, doesn't matter as much when we start to see increases. And benefits, broad agreement, we want to see this built in. We know there's another group working on it. This would be some endorsement for the other group coming up with some solutions. Then with regard to ratios and group size, the idea here is we have current program standards. Those need to be recognized as we work on what the base rate should be. This did surface, though, the need to look at the practicalities of how do we start to look at ratios and sensitivity to how does it matter where you may be under the standards or over the standards, and how to create some modeling of that. So this is something we really want to see played out in the cost modeling to understand how we look at the reference to program standards as we look at the creation of a base rate, and not wanting to overly complicate this. So these are things that exist. We don't want to try to create a whole new framework, but at the same time, how you incorporate what the reference to the standards will be as you come up with the rate structure will be important, and something that we hope to see addressed, we'll work to see addressed through the cost modeling. And then with regard to professional development support, New Mexico builds into their base that which is required for licensing. It seems like this group is supportive of that as a starting point. Also, though, wanting to see additional time attended to with regard to professional learning and ways to think about planning time. I think it's not clear yet as to how much of that is base, how much of that might be through enhancements that we create. And then with non-teaching personnel, a number of factors came up beyond what is listed here, and wanting, there did seem to be some acknowledgement of there's differences based on size of program that we may need to look at, and looking also at those other types of responsibilities that you want to see. And then non-personnel expenses is where we just ended with some things that are ongoing. There are some things that are periodic or one time. So thinking about the base as the part that's ongoing, thinking about those things that are periodically or periodic or related situations maybe being part of the enhancements. So I feel like, again, another lots of unpacking that we've done. More questions have been raised. This gives us an opportunity to come back to you with a bit more detail. We have planned for our next meeting to revisit this, but then really bring in what you've highlighted today, which is the parent perspective. And how then do we take the parent perspective and bring it back to the way that we see the base rates in a system that is really functioning on behalf of families and children, and then also incorporating, some references to what then, I think with time from P5 to help us think about how do we start to translate this into the cost model? How do we further refine the concrete nature of this as we get into cost modeling and the options and the ability to review those options? So we need to turn this over to public comment, and I want to appreciate everyone here for all that you continue to contribute, and looking forward to next week. And just a quick reminder before we turn it to public comment is our next meeting, we've shifted time a little. So this is one of those meetings we've added in. So it's June 17th. Instead of starting at 8:30, we're going to start at 9 and go till noon. So just wanted to make a note of that for everyone here. It's a slight change in schedule. It's a new meeting that's been added to. So that's what we have planned. So Karen, can I turn it back over to you to manage our public comments? And again, appreciate everyone being here today.
Yes, of course, Janelle. Thank you so much. And thank you, members of the public, for you. As you see, the chat feature is open. We'll also take some verbal comment now, and appreciating that some work group members may need to leave as it's 11:30, but we'll stay on. We would appreciate it if you want to make a verbal comment, if you could please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen and raise your hand immediately so that we see the extent of the queue. That'd be much appreciated. We'd like to ask that you take a minute or less to make your public comment verbally. We'll show a countdown clock to help you with that. When we invite you to unmute, if you could state your full name and any organizational affiliation that's relevant for the public record, thank you for that as well. And with that, I'm seeing one raised hand. Paul Butler, we invite you to unmute. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name's Paul, and I'm a researcher at Child Care Providers United. I just wanted to comment on the statement on the earlier base rate PowerPoint slide that discussing benefits is outside the scope of this work group. In our own contract, the rate and quality systems review section explicitly states that the new rate structure should advance, quote, changes needed to reimbursement rates and benefits to address providers' actual cost of care and address systemic inequities, end quote. That's directly from our contract with the state of California. So to be clear, we think that this rate restructure conversation should include a discussion of benefits. If we want to stabilize the industry, we have to look at compensation in total. Since the start of the pandemic, we've seen a 16% reduction in licensed childcare slots in California. And that's tied in large part to the fact that providers do not have the healthcare and retirement benefits that they need to stay afloat. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. Can I see one more hand? Mario Amaro, please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Mario Amaro. I'm a licensed child care provider here in LA County. I just wanted to give thank you guys for all the comments and the research you guys are doing. I did want to provide some feedback in regards to the training. I know you guys have been talking about it. One suggestion that I would give is just being a bit more flexible now that everything's online. If they could just do seminars, or probably just programs that where providers could do courses online and then complete them at their own time. Because in regards to my facility, I'm open 7 days a week, open from 5 a.m. all the way to 10 o'clock in the afternoon. So for me to kind of close down and go to a meeting or something like that would be not just an inconvenience for my business, but also for the parents, because we do work with a lot of low-income families, some to name from Children's Home Society and Child Lane with the programs that I work with here in the county. And so just so we also accommodate the parents and also have, the slots available for them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mario. I'm looking to the attendee participant panel, and I'm not seeing any more raised hands. I just want to take a beat here to see if we have a late raised hand. Yes, Heather Ruiz, please go ahead.
They bring me Richie, please.
Did it work?
Yes, go ahead. We can hear you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm a large family child care provider here in Tulare County, Central California. And in order for me to stay operating, I have to have subsidized children in my child care because of the rates. My private paying parents, they won't pay that. And I can't enroll families that I can't live on either. And I'm very excited that this is happening to give us an opportunity to stay open and afloat and education. And I had another point and I lost it and I'm very upset. Just thank you for considering us family home child care providers and the amount of hours that we put in. It's a lot of hours each day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Heather. And Susan Gilmore, I see your raised hand. We're going to invite you to unmute and speak.
Thank you so much. Susan Gilmore, I'm the founder and CEO of the North Bay Children's Center, a large regional nonprofit serving Marin and Sonoma counties. And I appreciate the points that Stephen and Eric raised about the rates. I do believe that the rates need to be regional. I mean, when I'm thinking about the service area that we're operating in, an unintended consequence of the recent rate increases has dramatically impacted our operations because we are in one county in Marin that the rate increase is now $26 per day higher than the daily rate for the same services we're providing in Sonoma County. And this has been a huge challenge for us to be able to use those dollars for staffing, for staff retention and recruitment when we can't use we have a salary scale that's the same in both counties and our operations are the same in both counties. And this has been a huge issue.
Thank you, Susan. Appreciate your input. I don't see any other hands raised. And so appreciating that, I believe we can keep the chat feature open and the meeting open for a few more minutes so that those who want to enter in public record and written format are welcome to do so. But I think with that, just once again want to thank work group members so much and members of the public for your attendance and engagement. And we will see you next Friday from 9 to noon. Thank you all. Bye-bye.